I'm here with Carter Dalton Lyons, and we're at the campus of Mississippi University for Women at the Eudora Welty Symposium, and Carter is the winner of the Eudora Welty Prize for his book, Sanctuaries of Segregation, the story of the Jackson Church Visit Campaign. I was just saying a second ago that this is a really elegant title, and it does something you may not have thought about that marketing directors love. And that's that it says exactly what it is in a lovely and perfect way without skating off into the lyrical and the flowery. Did you come up with this title exactly?
I did. And yes, I did put a lot of thought into it, and maybe not so much from a marketing standpoint, but yeah, wanting something that would capture the essence, but also the message of what I was trying to do, especially with, juxtaposed with the photograph, because one of the arguments of this book is that the space of church and these sanctuaries were one of the last sort of refuges for segregationists and others who really were losing in their effort by the moment that this campaign begins. And so that sort of double meaning of sanctuaries was something that I remember when I was this started as a master's thesis, is something, that idea of a sanctuary. So sanctuaries of something. And at the same time, I didn't want this to be a book about indictment, about to me it's more, even though there is a sad element to this, that these spaces, which these houses of God, were manipulated in this way. I didn't want this to be a book about that. I also wanted this to be a book of hope, and to really highlight those who were standing against this, and those working from within inside, who were trying to change this. And so that's really why I've liked this juxtaposition, because the photograph on the cover, which this was not a very well photographed event. This was an AP photographer who took this picture.
And it's outside the Episcopal Church?
And it's outside of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in downtown Jackson. And this is the second Sunday of the visits, but the first Sunday after Medgar Evers' murder. And this was the first Protestant church that admitted students. So yes, getting back to sort of the cover and the title, I like how on one hand you see this, and this sort of draws some questions. What's going on in there? Well, this is actually a sanctuary that was desegregated. I wouldn't say the students were necessarily welcomed there. They weren't asked to come. They showed up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that the title works well with that.
Good. Let's talk about what was happening, especially at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of this church visit campaign. The campaign itself is almost an ingenious act of forcing discussion, right?
That's right.
And proximity, as the sociologists say.
Right. Right.
What was going on? Who had thought it up? Who was driving it in Jackson?
So what's interesting, this phenomenon of kneel-ins or church visits, as it was called, it was a tactic that activists began utilizing in 1960 when SNCC was created.
Okay.
And
the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Right. When SNCC was created, as part of their charter, they made this and explained that this would be a useful way to stir the consciences of white Christians. And and so you do see that summer of 1960, you do see, amidst other direct action tactics, protests, marches, showing up to golf courses, showing up to art museums, showing up to lunch counters, most famously.
Lunch counters, yeah.
This was one of those contested public spaces that is documented at the time as happening on Sunday mornings. And most churches let them in. and whether they, again, not exactly they welcomed them in, but I think most reasoned that if we just let them in, then they won't target us anymore. They'll sort of
go away to the next church.
And so it really does, as a tactic, you don't really see it sustained, but it is talked about, especially in Alabama and in Mississippi, by local leaders in both places. And so really at the same time in Birmingham and in Jackson, amidst and this we're looking at 1963, the spring of '63, these local leaders are thinking about this as one of the many things that they will do in their direct action campaign that they're doing in each city. So in Jackson's case, they had by May of 1963 had engaged in a very confrontational series of protests, most famously that sit-in at the Woolworth's lunch counter, which was very violent. And at that point, the mayor does step in to grant some concessions that really serves to divide the leadership. But there were a few, Medgar Evers and Reverend Ed King, who was a white chaplain at Tougaloo College in Jackson, north of Jackson, that wanted to push ahead. And there's an injunction banning them from doing really anything, but they decided that church visitation is going to be the tactic that what we're going to do.
And banning them was the NAACP and others who said the mayor's just given us enough.
Right.
Don't do this.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And when they'd gotten an injunction from a judge specifically banning them from doing really anything.
Okay.
And so they knew they were going to get arrested. So
right.
What would be the most useful? And so this is when church visitation began. And in fact, Medgar Evers drove students to First Baptist. They tried to attend a variety of Protestant churches and a Catholic church. They were admitted into the Catholic church as they will to all the Catholic churches that they try to attend. But no Protestant churches let them in that Sunday. And so that was the first Sunday. That's one of the last things he did. He was murdered that Tuesday, and then the campaign continues. This picture on the book is on that second Sunday, when they were first admitted to a Protestant church in this case.
Let's talk about the level of defiance that was going on, because you do such a fine job of talking about how the national church organizations, say for example the Methodists, had declared that it is not within the message of Jesus Christ for you to deny the seating of anyone who comes to worship. And yet in Mississippi, it was clear that the body of Christ, those in the pews, felt extremely differently, even differently than their ministers. Talk about that tension.
Right, so there are all sorts of interesting tensions between the pastors and their congregations, and then between these churches and the denominations. You know, one thing that I go into is and you know, not that I discovered these things, but was sort of hidden from history, is that there were a number of ministers, Methodist ministers, the minister at First Christian, Trinity Lutheran, these flagship churches for their denominations in the state that took open stands, that took very prophetic stands for open doors, and had done so for a while. And so that, you know, you have these men, most of whom are native Southerners for what it's worth, who were presiding over these congregations that, you know, though there were a majority in these congregations that thought that civil rights activists were agitators and any black visitor showing up was an agitator and was not there for sincere reasons to worship. There was, you know, in each of these churches a sizable vocal minority that in for many years it's that minority that's sort of keeping that minister afloat. But these weekly confrontations on these church steps, that does prove to be too much for most of these ministers. So by the end of the campaign, most of these ministers are gone. They have been either
they've lost their livelihood, their job.
Right.
Wow.
And yes, so that other tension is between when these churches were not only barring black visitors, but adopting a vote, a lay board vote, whether it's the church council or the session of that church, voting to close the doors to any black visitors, they were doing so in direct defiance of the stated beliefs and policies of the United Methodist Church or the Evangelical Lutheran Church or the Southern Presbyterian Church.
Yeah,
they were violating all these, and so what it forced these denominations to do is to clarify, and that's one thing that they do. One of the impacts of this campaign is that these regional and national denominations do spell out more clearly, if it wasn't clear enough already, but they do spell out much more clearly that you cannot forbid someone to enter the church on the basis of race. And so that's really the moment when you see a lot of these breakaway churches form, a breakaway Anglican church. And in one case, a whole new denomination forms, the Independent Methodist Church, which is still based in Jackson, was formed at this time. So that you sort of see the segregationists retreat after this, once it becomes clear that they cannot. And in many cases, what was interesting is that so these pastors would leave after taking this prophetic stand, and then these churches realized that nobody's going to come. No pastor will come. We won't be able to call a new pastor until we change our policy, and that's when many of them, most of them, in fact, do back down at that point.
So the congregations begin to learn things from this. What did those ministers learn? There's a part of your book where the ministers who came down and participated in this went back to their parishes in the north, and they were changed.
That's right. So one of the things that happens during this campaign is that the police begin arresting students, and most of the arrests were in front of Methodist churches in October of '63. And so once that happens, and especially these were, in this case, Methodist students, the national, you have this kind of strange phenomenon. Well, now this gets broadcast across the country that this has happened, and so Methodist ministers throughout the country, especially in the Northeast and other parts of the South, who many of them know Reverend Ed King from seminary or have contact, that they begin coming Sunday by Sunday and going with these students, and not only that, you have the national denomination, the United Methodist Church, creates a bail money fund if they get arrested. So it's this odd scenario where the national denomination is paying to the bail money for anyone finding themselves arrested in that particular church. So yes, most of these ministers who came were already active within their communities. In fact, a few of the white Methodist ministers were at predominantly black Methodist churches and vice versa, and were very intentional about this. But for many of them, especially those in smaller communities, that they would return home and suddenly everybody wants to talk about this, and that's sort of their entryway into particular issues, whether it's solidifying the desegregation of the United Methodist Church, which was still ongoing, or one of the big issues they come home to dealing with, especially in the North, is housing and desegregated housing issues. So yeah, and for others, this is their kind of trigger event, and they use that phrase that this sets them on a path. Two of the men who two of the younger ministers who came to Jackson later became Methodist bishops, and they say that this was, if you want to trace the trajectory back, that it comes back to sort of this moment that began their leadership in the denomination.
What do you see in this story that you've done such a fine job of uncovering a story that hasn't seen great light? There was the Joe Reef book about the men who had the conviction to sign that manifesto.
Right.
But this book really uncovers that on the ground, local people action, direct action. What do you see about this history that is relevant, even painfully relevant right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think and I should say when I started doing the research for this, there were other scholars, religious scholars, and historians who were doing similar things, and Joe's one of them, and another a Rhodes professor named Stephen Haynes, a similar kind of book on a situation in Memphis called The Last Segregated Hour.
Okay.
And we were all in conversation with each other. It's kind of fun to
That's
do
lovely.
the research with these colleagues, and it's at a moment when churches were beginning to reevaluate their past, and and whole denominations like the PCA denomination reevaluating some of the racist roots of part of their past, and so the degree to which that this serves as some truth-telling in that process as these congregations and denominations are coming to grips with their past and the reconciliation that needs to happen. I hope it serves in that role in some point. That was when I began researching this, I quickly realized that this is not just something that interested me, but this is something that it's a story that needs to be told. Some truth needs to be told. There were, for instance, some churches who denied that this ever took place, and people who were defiant that their church never barred anybody. So this book is a kind of truth-telling document. If nothing else, I hope it helps in that regard.
Good. We've been talking with Carter Dalton Lyons, and he is the author of the Eudora Welty Prize winning Sanctuaries of Segregation, the story of the Jackson Church Visit Campaign. Thanks so much for sitting down with me.
Thank you. Thanks,
great.
Steve. Appreciate it.